Welcome to this XpoNorth panel session with me. My name's Tim Wright and three fabulous guests who are going to be exploring the notion of storytelling for audio. So this session is called Talk to Me. Today's storytelling for audio. Three fantastic guests will bring different perspectives. And over the course of the hour, we want to explore how to make good stories, what makes a good story, how they are used effectively in different contexts, how that may have changed over time, and how you can use these ideas in creating your audio materials as well. So if that's the session that you're expecting to attend, you're in the right one. If you're expecting to attend the dental surgery session, this isn't it. So let's start from that. I'm going to quickly introduce the three speakers. We have Pauline Moore, host, producer, editor, very well known these days for her Talking Dairy Girls podcast. I'll get that right. Talking Dairy Girls podcast. If I'm tripping over the word podcast, this is going to be a disastrous session, isn't it? I have Jaymeson Catsouphes, who is a founding member of Mumble Media, who has kindly joined us very early in the morning from the west coast of the US. And I have Lindsey Wilson of the extraordinarily fascinating app Geotourist. So I'm going to ask each of them to give us a brief introduction about themselves and how they use story and why it's relevant to what they do. And then we're going to start digging into some aspects more generic, and then we'll get into the details. So Lindsey, can I start with you and say, welcome to the session. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you do at Geotourist and how story plays a part in that?
Absolutely. At Geotourist, we basically answer the question, what makes people travel? We are a GPS-based app, although you can access us just through the browser. And we express the story of destinations through walking, running, cycling trails, driving trails, and we go direct to to users on smartphones. We help people explore the world on their own terms. And at Geotourist, our overarching objective is to map the world in audio. So no territory is excluded to us, and we won't stop until we get a pin in every country and in every town in every country and in every backwater there is, because we fundamentally believe that there is interesting stories for everyone. There's something to learn across the globe.
Map the world in audio. I like
Yes.
that. I like that. Can I just ask, just to clarify for my benefit, is the audio all produced by you, or is some of it coming from individuals that are consuming the journeys that you're producing?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Because of course, we can produce the audio, but we firmly believe that the most interesting voices are authentic. They are local, and it comes down to accent, dialect. Even in Scotland, we have such richness that comes from people's own voices. So it's important that the community speak on our tours. So we will always advocate that people give us their audio, but we help them generate it. We don't leave them high and dry. We support them through it.
Fantastic. So it's crowdsourced with a little bit of polish from you.
So yes.
Fabulous, fabulous. Pauline, I'm going to let Jamie recover a little bit and drink more coffee so that he's perfectly alert for when we get to him. So Pauline Moore, welcome to the session. Do tell us about your experience from being a journalist into production and your work on the Talking Dairy Girls podcast, and where story fits in with that extraordinary back catalogue that you've got.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, I'm a radio journalist. I trained as a radio journalist. A lot of courses now, you do media and you do all things, but this was pure radio. We were taught how to use sound, how to write stories to be heard. So I've always had an interest in radio. So I worked in Northern Ireland as a reporter for about 8 years, and then came to Scotland as a producer. Worked on Radio Scotland. I've been working there for the last 20 years. But for me, I produced live programs, news programs, so breaking stories and things that have been maybe curated, or picking the right people to talk and getting the chemistry right of contributors to news analysis programs mostly.
Right.
But for the last few years, I've been freelance. I was working in the BBC and I left. So I've been working a bit like an emergency plumber, where you're called in because there's a gap or there's a leak in the router. But I've gone back to what I used to do, which was, recording things or making features, either long form or short form, doing some production. And in the last while, podcasts. I mean, that's the thing to be doing now. And it's great because I think we're in a golden age of audio again. There's always been sort of, it goes up and down, and people keep thinking, oh, television took over and things, and it's all led by pictures, even with social media. But I think in the last 18 months or so, story and hearing story and being able to listen in different circumstances has become very important. It's become very important to me in the work that I do and the different podcasts I've been working on, and mostly what we've been doing now with Talking Dairy Girls.
Yeah, I mean, the death of podcasts has been predicted many times, hasn't it? But they seem to just come back and keep biting us. And there's more. I think there has to be more podcasts today than there's ever been, I think. And it's that flexible format, isn't it? What is it they say? It's useful, particularly in eyes busy moments. So you can do other stuff and still consume podcasts. So tremendously flexible format. Yes, I think we've got them around for a long time. So I'm sure we're going to come back to that. Thanks, Pauline. And Jamie, here it is. Your time has come. So introduce us to Mumble Media, what it is that you do, and where story fits in with your work. I believe you're in San Francisco at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, Oakland, but yeah, the Bay Area.
Oakland, right?
Yeah, Northern California. So I started Mumble Media with 2 other business partners towards the end of 2020, and it's primarily like a post-production service provider for audio projects, and so that spans like both fiction and also nonfiction, so kind of more traditional radio journalism, documentary type work. But in a lot of cases, a lot of the projects that we work on, we're kind of on the telling side of the storytelling equation. So we're working with people who have incredible stories, and we're trying to kind of mold that and shape it and package it into something awesome and compelling. But my background before starting Mumble Media is kind of similar to Pauline's, or kind of started in the public radio world and was learning how to do journalism type things. And then, but always in the back of my head, I was like, oh, but what if we could do like Hitchhiker's Guide for the Galaxy again or something like that? And that was, over a decade ago. And now here we are in this land of audio where, the golden age of audio, where fiction podcasts are a thing again. I know in the UK and in Ireland, you guys have had a long history of radio drama and stuff, but in the US, it kind of fell off, and now it seems like there's a real revival. So, so we're really excited about that. And for a lot of people in the industry, at least in the US, it's kind of this new, it's kind of like a renaissance of audio fiction, where we're trying to figure out like, how do we work in this medium? Because there's a lot of things that we can pull from other different art forms, like film and TV, from video game sound design, from traditional radio podcast stuff and storytelling. And so a lot of the stuff that I think about these days is, how can I kind of grab all the knowledge from all the different kind of tangential industries and put that into what I'm focused on, which is primarily audio fiction.
Fantastic. And that's an interesting one. I'm gonna leave a question with you, Jamie. It's because you do fiction work as well, and I'm gonna actually, this is a question for all of you, which we can return to at some point when you've reflected on it. But does a story need to be true? So I'm just going to leave that one out there. And let's start with something a little bit simpler. I'd love to know, and feel free, all 3 of you feel free to pitch in as you see fit on this. What makes a good story? Lindsey.
I might be the wrong person to ask, because everything makes a good story.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. I think that we should not ever believe that there isn't something of value in what someone has got to say to someone else in the world. I mean, there's a difference between a good story and a great story, an exceptional story. But it's And then from our point of view, there is somewhere in the world that just has something special that sets it apart. You know, whether it's a rock formation on the end of Arran, or a tree in a churchyard in Sussex that was planted by Queen Elizabeth I. Until you know that, it's a tree. Once you get the story, it gives you context, it gives you a connection. So as long as there's a point of connection, you've got a great story.
But you were also talking earlier on. I mean, the reason I came to you is that you were quite emphatic on the importance of authenticity and the voices and things being authentic to make a piece of audio work. And I suppose in a story, doesn't just an anecdote suffice to make a story, or does it have to have a proper arc to beginning, middle, and end to make it really engaging and compelling? And is that something that's specific in your area, or would it go across to podcasts and other types of audio production? So Pauline and Jamie, I'm queuing you up there.
Okay. Sorry, will I come in here? I mean, authenticity is something that I picked up that Lindsey said as well, but I think there has to be, just thinking about what you say, does a story have to be true? I don't know if it has to be true, but it has to be believable. It has to be something that could happen. So it has to have a logic to it. I mean, my background is news, and I would have been covering a lot of what I covered in my very early days were committee meetings at local council. You know, and you would have to deliver. So you had to deliver your 40-second voicer and your package, you know, with sound in it and voices and write copy as well. And it always amazed me about the 40-second voicer. So how do you get a 3-hour committee meeting about street lighting into 40 seconds? You know, maybe there would be, especially it was Northern Ireland, it was Derry, so there was going to be rows, you know, there was going to be falling out. But it was funny that even with a 40-second, I mean, that's sort of like now they're called flash fiction in a way, or a flash story. People heard different things, you know, so, you know, depending on their political leanings, even as something as simple as street lighting, you know, people would have heard something different. And, you know, you'd know this because they'd ring in and complain, I didn't say that, or, you know, that wasn't the way the story was. So, I mean, I think how a story is told is important as well. And I think, you know, yes, there are conventions to storytelling, you know, the beginning, middle, end, or the what if, and then this happened, you know, so I think that's what a story is, and that's what people expect when they hear a story, is that there is some structure. You can play around with it. You can play around with it in sound and everything else, but to be a satisfactory listen for somebody, I think that you know, you do have to bear those in mind, you know, that it does, yeah, there's 3 parts to it. If you're making a film, it could be 5 or 7 acts, you know, or sort of stages to it. But I think for telling a story, it has to go somewhere, and somebody has to take it somewhere, like a character, or the next bit of the story has to carry on and build and then conclude.
Does that ring true for you, Jamie?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think what both Lindsey and Pauline have said made 100% sense. And Lindsey, I really like where you started with the, like, a tree on the side of a road is a tree until you understand the context and why it's important and all the, you know, the history and the details and stuff. And I think for me, like, there's lots of people who have talked very eloquently about kind of the building blocks of storytelling and how to do it in a way that feels satisfactory and that people can understand and follow. But I think when it comes to the question of, like, what is a good story and how do you tell a story well, and find a story that matters to you and to people, I think, I think it's the tree analogy is great for me, because I think it's, you know, you can tell a story about anything. But when I think about the stories that really stick with me, it's the ones that are coming from a very unique perspective of, like, oh, this is a thing I've never thought about before. Mm-hmm. But within that context of that very specific story, there's things that anyone coming from any walk of, you know, background, life experience, there's things that they can like grab onto, and it helps them make sense of not just the tree that you're talking about, but everything else. And, you know, I think about like podcasts that I listen to that I think do a great job of that, like 99% Invisible, which a lot of people know, of course, but I mean, it's a great example of that, because it is a very niche topic of, like, design, you know, like people are, you know, study that and are like, heads down people who do that for a living obviously care a lot about it and have a lot of thoughts, but you wouldn't be like, oh, check out this design podcast. But that's pretty much what they do with every single one of their episodes and stories, is like, we're going to take this pretty esoteric thing like egress stairways in corporate buildings, and then you listen to the story and you're like, oh my God, that's the most amazing thing. So I think for me, when I think about like, I'm using a nonfiction example, but it applies to fiction stuff as well, of being able to have that like really unique perspective, but then also make it accessible and fascinating to anybody. And I think for me, that's kind of what I'm always looking for in a good story. The good news for me is being on more of the telling side of the storytelling thing. Usually what I'm working with is someone already has a great story and I'm just working on shaping it. So yeah, focus a little bit more on the formula stuff and the techniques and the dressing that goes around the story. But you know, obviously if someone doesn't have a great story to begin with that, you know, you can't relate to and find interesting, then anything I do after that is going to be maybe not so great.
I mean, it's a great point. And I mean, we hear a lot in recent years of the idea that I hate to introduce the topic, and I don't want to stay on the topic, but politicians, instead of making policy announcements, they are always encouraged now to have narrative. Which I think is meant, my understanding is that it meant to make the policy relatable to it, something that's understandable to somebody's context. So that kind of leads me to the question, is narrative the same as a story? And when does an anecdote become a story, or does it not matter at all? You know, would you approach these things differently? If you were commissioned to do something, we want anecdotes, or would you approach it differently if they said we want stories or narrative? Is there a difference between them? And if there is, what is it? Or if not, does it not matter?
Yeah. I think anecdotes can go to make up a bigger story. I go back to the sort of the pure art of the storyteller. You know, the professional storytellers that get up in front of an audience and have spent years honing their craft. And I've spent time talking to some at a big storytelling festival in Tennessee, actually in Jonesboro in Tennessee, which has got an international storytelling festival. And I remember talking to a storyteller about how long does it take you to get your story? And it can take anything from 2 to 7 years for them to work on it, to, you know, but it's a performance. But some of the things that they were saying about that, and you know, the wonderment that's in that, or the act of listening. So anecdotes can be little short examples of something that can fit into a larger narrative, I think, you know. So it can come from, I mean, when we do Talking Dairy Girls, there's wee asides that we have, or stories that take us a slight different direction. But if you have the, you know, if you have the direction of travel of that story, you know, we bring in clips and things, or, you know. So I don't know if I'm answering it very well, but yeah, I think story has to take in a direction, but those short little bits. And I think with politicians, I mean, that's the other thing when you mentioned about politicians, because, you know, stories that are told in front of people who are coming to it with their own bias or their own prejudice will be taken in a certain way. It does actually affect your brain in some way, hearing a story. Politicians know that. And stories can be used to the good, to shape, to challenge, to influence, to help change minds about certain things, or influence thinking, or they can be used for negative reasons, to sell a story of what a politician thinks or feels, and, you know, can basically be false, or can be and carry a crowd because it's what they're hungry to hear. And in a lot of cases, there's a crowd in front of that storyteller. So all the things that go with traditional storytelling, of getting into a sort of like hypnotic state of giving yourself over to what they call deep listening and involvement in the story, where you sort of are entranced with it and you're carried along with it, can work to the good or the bad.
That's really interesting, and I think the idea of the sort of episodic piece, in a way, is important to you, Lindsey, because if in one of a Geotours you have multiple pieces of audio, multiple stories and anecdotes from different contributors, how do you work to link those things together? And how do we think about well, I think we should come back to the performance piece at some point, Pauline. I think that's a really interesting piece about the delivery of a story. But how does one link together those smaller pieces into a larger and into a larger narrative? And I guess James, you might think about this from a serial of podcasts. How does one carry it through a series? So, Lindsey, have you got thoughts on how you sew these things into a silk purse from a series of sow's ears?
Yeah, well, I find what Pauline said was really interesting. And sometimes we need to remember that there are storytellers, but there are story listeners. And while we know what we are going to tell people, we have no idea what the story listeners will bring to the relationship. And while not everyone might believe they're a natural storyteller, I believe everyone has the capacity to be a storyteller. We are taught from a very young age to be story listeners. That is how we start to understand the fundamentals about the world around us. So when we are telling our stories through Geotourist, the structure in the traditional way is less important. We don't necessarily need a start and an end with a middle, like you might think over the whole stretch of a country or a particular place. We can tell a micro story that is rooted to one spot in time. And the best way, I suppose, to do an example of that, there's the island of Arran, and we're just about to launch a tour with them. And there is a point on the island of Arran that is a castle. And that castle is the inspiration for the Black Isle cover of Tintin. So there is a micro story that I wasn't aware of. And to that, I bring my Tintin experience, and that then routes me to the spot of Arran. So that's what makes me want to travel. I wanted to go anyway, but now I have got to put myself there. So then that connects to the wider tale of the island, because there's your whole episode. It's the episode of the island of Arran. But what we can do is we can layer it up through different tours. We have we were part of a project with London and Partners to create a second London to get people out. And I'm aware that what we do is quite different to the storytelling that the other two do. So I can see lots of similarities, lots of differences. We took them to Hastings, and then we took them to Battle to show them the town of Battle. To that, then we have another tour, because the band Keen come from Battle, and the Somewhere Only We Know is actually in Battle, so I know where that is. And if you go on our app, you can find out where that is. So there's another, there's another episode, and it sits very firmly linked to the Battle one. Then there's a children's tour of Battle, and so it doesn't necessarily, there's no reason not to do all three and to link them all together and build your own story. So for us, it can be very short, or it can stretch across something like the whole of Scotland and taking the Outlander story, which we have. There's no boundaries. We are fluid, and we like that.
That's great. And James, from your perspective, how does that work in a series as opposed to a one-off? How do you manage to carry these things across an extended session? Is it a little bit like a soap opera, or is there ways of doing this more effectively?
I think that it's a great question. I think it's something that's evolving and that we talk about constantly, and there's no one answer, right? So I'll start with that. But it is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and especially thinking about again, looking towards other formats and media to draw inspiration and draw analogies and draw connections to. I've been thinking a lot about how the idea of having a single contained, like, I'm going to say mini series, but limited series of like a thing that, you go into producing, let's say a 10 episode run, and you know where it's going to start, you know where it's going to end, you know what the characters are, and kind of that approach of writing, or whether it's a film or something like that, where you're kind of going into production already knowing what the story is, knowing that it's set. That's kind of like one approach. But in the TV world, you get this really interesting thing where the story that you're telling is open-ended, and you kind of have a cast of characters, and you have things, kind of like what Lindsey was saying, is you can stay pretty far out and just focus on the group dynamics. You can go very focus in on one specific character and like a struggle that they're having. It gives you a lot of flexibility just in terms of what you as an artist and as a storyteller want to focus on. So that I think that's absolutely right. But what I think about in that context is I think it's really important as artists, storytellers, producers, writers. I think in the world of like network TV, where you're kind of going season to season, you might get greenlit for 1 season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons. There's so many examples of these like cult classic shows that have had the space to breathe, and kind of like, I think Lindsey, you were saying the dynamic between the storyteller and the story listener, which I love. In that format where you have this kind of episodic ongoing TV thing, you are getting feedback from the listener, from the fans. And you're also, as a creator, you're also needing to put on that hat of being the story listener as well. And there's examples of this, like The Office, the US version. I don't know a lot about the the original version. But like when that first came out, first season, it was kind of like meh. And now it's grown into this huge cult thing that everyone's like, oh, it was amazing. But people kind of forget, like, yeah, it was finding its voice and finding its footing in the first couple of seasons. And like the main character played by Steve Carell, like, he wasn't very likable, and that was one of the things that needed to change. And I had another example too of a similar show, but anyway, but I think that's a really interesting dynamic of kind of giving artists space to tell those stories, to find the stories, to find what's interesting, to find what resonates and connects. And so I think that's kind of where my head goes with the episodic and the open-endedness. But to get back to the original question about like narrative versus anecdotes and do stories need to be true? I mean, I think it's a little bit of our responsibility as storytellers to, whether they're based in fact, to still build narratives that are true. And again, coming back to that idea of using stories to kind of find a viewpoint and then create greater understanding and greater context through which we can understand our life experiences. I think if we are basically creating a false lens through our story and through our narrative of like, oh, I understand this thing, or it's telling me what I want to hear, but it's not actually reflective of actual life experience, I think that can be a problematic thing. It certainly happens a lot. And like you were saying, in politics too, but I think the flip side is also very true, where the human brain like craves that understanding. It craves something, it craves context, it creates, if you just throw numbers at somebody, they're going to be like, okay, 100 bazillion jillion, sure, sounds good. But if you understand, like, okay, put that in reference to something else, put that in over time, that's where we start to get more into like using storytelling to tell the importance of numbers and facts. And I think with the pandemic stuff, I think that's one of the more interesting things to me of like, you can have the stats and you can have the risks and stuff, but putting that in context of, okay, like give me a touch point, right? And I think that's what stories do, and I think that's what politicians also try to do with their policies and stuff. But anyway, yeah, I think it's all related to just this. The purpose of story is trying to find understanding in the things around us.
Yeah, and it's in terms of purpose, it's a fascinating area, I suppose, because we all know that storytelling has such an ancient tradition, and in some cases, it's about, we can look at examples of keeping cultural histories alive and transferred through, but we can also see, fairy tales as being metaphorical and teaching and instructive. So there are different formats to form different purposes, I guess, that we encounter through this. I'm interested, Pauline and Lindsey. Lindsey, you made the point that we are taught to be listeners, and Pauline made reference to storytellers and the process of telling stories. So I think that that does that perhaps draw a false dichotomy that there is one or t'other? And I'm interested, Pauline, from a journalistic point of view, where you see the role of the person to catalyze somebody into telling a story. You know, how one brings out a story, whether you, because clearly a storyteller who is a professional storyteller works at their craft, and in Lindsey's case, it tells us there are people that purely passively consume, but there's also something in between as well. And I guess in your roles as producers and journalists and things, you'll encounter these things in different ways.
For me, it's talking to people and listening. So, you know, if you've got I produce different programs, arts programs, but also sort of a Sunday morning sort of religious leaning program, but not necessarily, it can be about culture and morals, ethics, but you want people on the, you know, so you're going to experts sometimes, or you're going to people who have a story, and it's teasing out of them, it's just talking to them, and you can spend quite a lot of time just finding what the nub of the story is. I mean, that's sort of the skills that you learn as a journalist, is where is the story, or which story should we go with, because I think there is choice in there. And that's, you know, so, you know, it's not just like you're presented with facts and numbers and figures. You decide who you're going to get to talk about that, where are they coming from, and you know, you have to sort of measure your own biases on that. And I think actually in that general storytelling, that you pick the stories as a producer or an editor that are going to work into this mix, especially when it comes to things like true crime, I think, or even, you know, those kind of stories, is who you go to. Who do you know, if you're not getting any cooperation from the police, well, then do you go to the family? Do you, you know, so you're piecing together a story, not the story, because there can be different, you know, very, very different stories. But how you tease that out of people is just by, I mean, I'm just thinking recently, when any kind of stories I've done where you know, you spend a lot of time looking up things, and you find something that somebody's written, so you try and contact them, which can also, you know, take a lot of time, and then talk to them, and then they might just say something. I'm trying to think. I talked to somebody, a writer, about a book he'd written about how the brain works, and how, you know, prejudice and things, and how that, and in the story, I mean, he was inspired to do this because he was beaten up in his 20s outside a pub, and so that story influenced all the research he did thereafter as a neurologist. But getting that story and how he felt about that, I mean, that makes the connection. You're looking for the point that makes the connection. It's like in a painting or a film. As David Lynch used to talk about the eye of the duck in a film. What is it? And isn't it the golden spot in a painting? You know, it's the thing that draws your eye in, and then you can move out of it. So that's what you're looking for. You know, you're looking to get in there. And I think short stories are a good way of looking at a model of this. You know, where do you start? Where do you start your story with somebody? Do you bring it in? Do you have to have a lot of exposition of what it is, or do you get in there and then work back a few layers? And that's the sort of the thing that I would work at as a producer, if I'm producing somebody else's work, or getting them to be a guest on a program to tell their story. And one of the things about radio is very short. You know, you don't often get the luxury of time to tell a story. Fern Cotton was on a conference I was attending just recently, and she was saying how, you know, she had reached a point in her career as she worked on Radio 1, she had a music show, and she talked to people, but she says, like, all our interviews were no longer than 5 minutes, and they were just starting to get interesting, and then, you know, they would say, we've run out of time. And for me, radio programs I worked at and news analysis, I wanted to pick up on this is really interesting, but we're running out of time. I wanted to start at the point where we're running out of time to get into that bit of the story, because the longer you keep people talking, the more they'll tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something, again, we should return to. I think this whole idea of attention span and how long you can engage people for. But Lindsey, you obviously are, you know, encouraging perhaps non-professional people to contribute their stories and anecdotes. How do you encourage them to do it well? What sort of techniques and approaches do you use to get people to go from from being just a monosyllabic response to being able to tell a decent story that's consumable by your users?
Honesty. I agree with what Pauline says about the golden spot, and for me, I think of it as the wow moment, the goosebumps, the moment of connection. And it's not for us to decide what will create others goosebumps moments, but within our tours there are lots of them, and it is just telling people that what they have got to say will be interesting to someone else. There's no judgment, because fundamentally they're telling the story of their place. And outside that, even within life, meeting someone on a bench, everything, everyone's got a thing of interest to say. And if you show that you have confidence in their storytelling, it can unravel them or let them blossom in the most amazing way. And sometimes it can be the fact that you are the person who is helping them piece together their story, and is the one that says, what you're doing is good, keep going, keep giving it to us, is enough. And they just they blossom in front of you. And that's when you get to the really good nuts and bolts. They get past the things that they're used to say or ready to say, and then they start chucking little things in, and that's really where you can find the moments of absolute goldness.
So that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because that reflects the sort of interactive nature of a performer as a storyteller. A storyteller will be responding to an audience. That becomes slightly problematic when we formally record things and put them out in a podcast. But in terms of drawing somebody out, and it's sometimes conversational pieces seem to be a good and legitimate approach to get the less professional storyteller to open up a bit. Different to performing as a storyteller in a recording, which is then going to go into maybe a podcast or something like that. I mean, James, have you encountered those two sides of that? And does it become, do you prefer to work with the performers, or do you like that kind of dynamic of the interaction to bring out, I don't know, does it make it more authentic? Does it make it more personable?
I've worked in both contexts, and I think they're both great. I mean, I think what's interesting, what both Lindsey and Pauline have been talking about, is in a lot of cases, a lot of the projects that we work on, a lot of the work that we do, the person who has the story, who's lived the experience, isn't actually necessarily a storyteller. And so our whole job is to basically be the storyteller for them and to do that story justice. And I think it's the stories that I enjoy the most are the ones where you can feature and showcase that authentic voice as much as possible. And so in kind of documentary work or very heavily interview based kind of nonfiction stuff, I personally tend to gravitate towards kind of as either non-narrated or as lightly narrated as possible, just because I think, well, people might not know where to start with their own story. They might start with, well, I was born in 19 whatever, and then you get the whole history, and people are like, and so that's your job, is to edit, find where that starting point is. Where's the golden eye? Which again, I love that image. But so I think that's kind of, I really enjoy that work of taking 2 hours of tape and finding the 5 or 10 minutes that's really the core of the story. But I've also worked on a few projects where they're kind of your performative storyteller, your host, your narrator is talking in a more first person perspective about the story. And I think those are also really compelling. And the challenge with those is it is more performative. So the success of that and people's feeling of like the charisma and the connection with that host largely rides on the host. But in a lot of cases, if someone's like really passionate about that thing, it comes through. They may not be the most polished narrative storyteller, host person, but that passion and that excitement, it really makes a huge difference. So I think those are the things that I like. And just one small example of that. I'm going to blank on the name of the podcast, but there was a great host who did a podcast series about the 94 and 98 men's US World Cup teams. And it was just that I enjoyed it so much because you could tell like he was talking about the experience of being, I think he was, grew up in England, went to the US and was like trying to be a soccer fan in the US, and then was watching like a country who does not have football, like much of a football following.
It's soccer, Jamie. Just soccer.
And then following this team that just then you get all these dynamics and stuff, but throughout all of it, you just get this incredible sense of like passion and excitement, and so when it's a narrator who actually has a connection to the story, I just think it kind of takes it from like here's me telling this story to like, here's this story that like, okay, it's not about me, I wasn't on the team, but like, and I think that it's a really interesting example of like the middle ground of story listener equals storyteller, and kind of brings all the pieces together. So I'll try and figure out what the name of that podcast is.
No,
I think it was American
great.
Fiasco or something
fantastic,
like that.
Fantastic. Well, that's a really, you raised some great points there, and Pauline, you made a terrific point about the current, if you will, brevity of radio. I'm always, as I'm of a certain age, I find into a lot of the interviewing that's done these days on radio and TV is very frustrating, because for exactly that reason, it's too short. And my memory goes back to really quite extended, talking heads interviews, which really gave people the space to open up a little bit. So I'm conscious of the fact that, I am a certain segment of a particular audience. So how much does consideration of your audience influence the material that you produce? I'm guessing, Lindsey, you have to produce for as wide a demographic as possible. But how much does this figure in your mind, and how specific can you be, or do you want to be, in terms of producing the content for your audience? Should it be as wide as possible, or does it not really matter? And that might be attention span, linguistics, all types of things. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
With radio, I mean, I've been thinking about this because I was thinking of what is different, what has changed about radio, and what is different between radio and podcasting. Radio, a station has an identity, and it has a culture, and I think, well, the likes of the BBC really has to be more generalist. They have to cover all sides. They have to think their audiences, and they have targets of audiences they'd like to have, and which is sometimes very different to the reality. So they aim for the 25 to 39-year-olds, but actually their audiences are the 55 to 65-year-olds. So I think radio has to try and be everything to everybody in the BBC sense, and you'll get more niche radio stations now, like jazz stations, and a lot of them are music led, not speech led. So yeah, a connection with the audience is the time it goes out at, because again, with radio, there's a schedule. So our program goes out at a certain time. So you have to think of, well, this is going out at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So we have to be mindful of who's going to be listening at that time, or, what kind of stories you're telling. Even news stories, they might differ during the day depending on when the schedule is. But I mean, that's changing a bit for radio, because now with BBC Sounds and things, or with other stations as well, you don't actually have to listen in a linear fashion. You don't have to switch on to get the news in the morning. You can listen to it later, or you can, various programs, pick and choose when you want to listen to them. So with podcasts, what Fern Cotton went on to say was that she had started doing podcasts, and it opened her eyes to that you could actually have long, decent chats with people. And that's what I think podcasting does well in conversations. I was just thinking about this when Jamie was talking. I worked on a crime fiction podcast, which has an audience. That has it has a big audience, but they tune in because they want to hear that writer talk, and they're being interviewed. And I was just thinking, this author, he's a very famous author. I'll name him, you won't mind, Peter May. And his latest book came out. But when I listened to a few interviews he did where he talked about the book, but then I picked up in something he said in a blog that this wasn't the book that he had ever intended to write. So for me, immediately when I talked to the presenter of the podcast, I said, let's find out why he couldn't do it. It was because of COVID, he couldn't travel. So he wrote his novel about up the road, the next village, and built a story around that and brought COVID into it. And it was different, it was a bit different to but it was just it's the research, it's the finding out, and just finding that little thing that's going to make it stand out from all the others. Because Peter May was being interviewed everywhere. But I did hear some radio interviews he did that were like 6 minutes long. That's quite long in radio life, and they never got into that because they didn't have the time. Whereas when we did, we had him for an hour. We had him for as long as it took for him to tell a story, basically, because with podcasts, you don't have that. It has to be a certain length, and even a documentary or a long interview has to be 28.5 minutes because the next program's starting. So even ones that are made into podcasts, they are time limited. So, but I think actually one of the challenges for podcasting as well is, how do you know when to stop? I mean, how do you know when is the story over? And I think, I edit for Talking Dairy Girls, we do this, but we've all had a broadcasting background at various levels of experience and things, but we sort of know the rhythm. We know the rhythm of a story. We know when it's coming or when to move. And if you don't, I edit it out afterwards. So a lot of, either you have the structure when you're going in, or else you structure it afterwards. So you just let things go a wee bit, but then afterwards, when you're you could have an hour, as you say, 2 hours of material that you're finding the golden moment. But if it's an hour long, you've got to lose a lot of material. What do you lose? Do you switch the order of things? So all those kind of considerations come in that you impose maybe after the recording as well.
Yeah.
I think that's your question.
All good reflections. Lindsey, how about for you? I mean, do you have to consider your different audiences? Because I would imagine that the people that are consuming the material that you produce will be across a lot of different age ranges, different demographics, different linguistics and things. And I suppose there's probably something about the material that are produced that they will consume it once, whereas because they'll do their visit, they'll do their walk, whatever it is, and then they'll move on somewhere else. Whereas a lot of other material might be something that is repeat listened to. So does it make considerations different for you in terms of how you prepare things?
So what we can do is, when we're working with our partners, we can say, like, if you have no real idea what your story is, you can make it 10 points. And you can think about what geography it spans, or you can make it 20, or it can be particularly niche and you can make it 5 points, because that story is so worth telling that you just want to pin it on the map and leave it there for people to interact with. What we can do from our point of view is it generates data, and I suppose we all reserve the right, partners included, to suspend our assumptions until we see what the data generates, and that can chuck up some really interesting findings. So what we also find is that some people do listen to it in situ and then come home and listen to it again. So that's quite an interesting thing. And with our tours, with our content, you can ping a tour, you can ping a point over social media. So it is like a postcard, a virtual postcard. So in terms of where the reach stops, it isn't as straightforward as it's a one listen. It can go quite far across the world. But in terms of our audience, I suppose that we work with our partners, and we help them reach their perceived audience, and sometimes it's not who they think it is. So there's always room for discovery.
Great, interesting stuff, and certainly that analyzing the metrics and seeing what works and what doesn't, it must be a fascinating thing. And I guess that's open to well, you can do it in a much more specific way, I guess. But I guess there's an awful lot of audience research goes on for all of you. I just want to ask a question of all of you again. How much embellishment do you need around just voice? I mean, I when you say to me storytelling, that implies somebody telling a story. How much embellishment do you need in terms of sound effects and incidental music, and does it, where do you draw the line on this? I mean, personally, I find documentaries and news reports that have incidental music that tell you how you're supposed to be feeling incredibly annoying, but that may just be me. But I mean, it's a consideration for all of you producers when you're doing something that is story led. How much additional embellishment do you think you need? And I'm gonna pick on James first because I'm just feeling mean.
Well, no, I mean, it's a topic that I've thought a lot about personally in the work that I'm doing now, but also before we started Mumble Media, me and my other co-founders were all working at Audible. And so coming from an audiobook background, which also, again, thinking about the length conversation, they want hours and hours of content, and the idea of just only doing an hour is like, what? Short form. But yeah, and the trick of editing yourself that's absolutely the thing. But yeah, the aesthetic of the thing you're producing and what it needs, what you want to do as a creative artist. I don't know if there is an answer. I think the guiding principle that I try to keep in mind is, what does the story need? And I think and also what is your audience expecting too? Because I think, again, just using the Audible context, the people there are audiobook listeners and they're expecting a narrator, maybe doing some voices, but largely they're expecting someone to read a story to them. And it's fascinating. I mean, not everybody enjoys an audiobook, but for people who enjoy it, that's enough. And I think where I'm finding myself in that world is like, okay, like audiobooks are cool. We've done that. We've also seen like the advancements that have happened in the podcast space of places like Radiolab with tons of like very fine editing and lots of sound effects and sound design. I also totally agree with you. Like when I'm listening to something that's like really ham-fisted telling me like, and now you feel sad. It's just like, oh my God. And it happens a lot. And I think it happens a lot also in contexts where people are trying to get through content really quickly. And so like in the news world, trying to do that sort of underscoring in a way that's like thoughtful or delicate is really difficult because you have deadlines and, you need to get the content out as quickly as possible. And so you're just kind of painting with a really broad brush. But yeah, a lot of my job on a lot of my projects is exactly finding that line of like, okay, how do we add something here that enhances the story, doesn't distract from it, isn't going to irritate people. And yeah, and a lot of times it is like, okay, you might layer in some soundtrack and then you mute the track and listen back and I'm like, am I doing it justice? And I think what's interesting is oftentimes the more emotional the story is, or the more emotional the moment is, the more I find myself doing nothing. Like I was, yeah, I was editing a story recently about 9/11, and they're talking about like a pretty heavy moment, and I'm combing through the music library trying to find the right piece of music, and then I put something and I was like, this isn't right. I was listening back and just took it out, and I was like, yep, that was the answer. That's why I couldn't find the right piece of music, because it didn't need it. But I think in general, my opinion is, if you have the time and the budget to give the listener a little something extra, and do it in a thoughtful way, I think it's worth it. But
Pauline, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, for music, people, you say music, but I use a lot of natural sound. I record out as much as I can out somewhere. And I've been squirreling away sounds from I was no age, you know, they're on cassettes and things. And but also, you know, just trains in America, spring peepers in Virginia. You would know about that, Jamie, the frogs. And they have crept into quite a few documentaries that I've made when they're called for. I'm just thinking, because there's an interesting story we have, because music is a big, for podcasts. For radio, it's quite straightforward. You use a piece of music. I've used songs with lyrics in them sometimes to slow down a story, just to give it room. But, you know, I find like silence is amazing, or just the pause, or the person in a moment where they're struggling, just let them. Just don't edit it tight. Don't take that out. Leave it, because that is the bit that draws people in. In audio, silence, and this is a tip I would give people: just let things breathe. And if you can, you've got time. Even when you don't have time, I kept them in, even like 10 seconds of somebody just breathing because they don't know what to say, says so much. And when there's a lot of noise, when something stops, people pay attention no matter what they're doing. But just getting back to use of music, I mean, for podcasting, it's a really tricky area because you cannot use any music unless you commission it. For the podcast I'm working on at the minute, Talking Dairy Girls, we decided we wanted to have a good catchy theme tune. So we picked Danny Boy, the London Dairy Air, because it's from Derry. It's also out of copyright. So,
always handy.
Yes, so we got somebody to arrange it, but it's become a part. We got a disco version, we've got a bossa nova one, we've got a sad piano one, but just recently, because we were talking as well about, you know, engagement with people, and people on our Facebook page have been posting. We have never really made much about the Danny Boy. We got a musician to arrange it for us, different versions, but just the other day, somebody in Canada who's been with us from our podcast from the beginning put on a harpist from the Canadian Symphony Orchestra playing Danny Boy. And I just said, wow, do you think we could use it? I'd love us to be able to use it. And he came back to me, says, I'm on the case. I'm going to try and see if I can. So, you know, that's where the story changes. This guy now is part of the story of Talking Dairy Girls, you know, because we'll get him to get it. We'll tell a bit of the story of how he did that. So that's what you're doing with podcasting more than with radio. And I don't know what the other thing is. You're building community. Yeah, you're building that, and you've got to. With radio, you deliver stories, you deliver things that goes out at a certain time, and that's it, really. Apart from maybe in social media, say it's on. But with podcasting, you've got to work at that. I mean, that is half the work, is just keeping that engagement and keeping people with you and having them have a sense of ownership. So then they tell other people, go, you must hear this. This is part of my life. This has now become part of what I do. So, you know, that's the thing that you really have to pay attention to, I think, especially for podcasting.
Yeah. And Lindsey, does an anecdote about a battle benefit from the sound of clashing of swords on shields, and rushing horses, and the cries of the wounded? Do these things enhance it or detract from it, in your view?
It's a good question, and I would agree with what both Pauline and Jimmy have said. But I suppose we reserve the right to make that decision until you understand the piece of audio that you're dealing with directly. We have with the Inverness Outlanders, we have a tour a point that covers Culloden. Now that has some music to it, and it is perfect and spot on, and it would lack occasion if it didn't have it. And then I was working with the Outer Hebrides, and they sent me a piece of audio, and I was going, what is that noise in the background? It wasn't a problem. And I said, oh, that's the pub. We did it in the pub. And I'm like, brilliant. I didn't know we could ask for that. Could you do this spot down at the beach, and we'll do one more and see if you can get some seagulls in it and make a bit outside broadcasting. And just dotted around the tour was island life, and that was good enough. So sometimes these things come organically, and that is okay. It's meant to be.
I like that. And the seagulls thing reminds me of how you have to be careful about these things, because I always remember Desert Island Discs, a famous BBC Radio 4 long-running program, introduced seagulls onto their theme tune and were roundly condemned for using the wrong sort of seagulls for a desert island. But there we go. So these things are the road to hell is paved with good intention, as they say. Now, listen, I could carry on this chat for the rest of the evening, but sadly we have to bring this to an end. I just want to say thank you to you all for fascinating perspectives on storytelling in all of your various areas. And I'd like to thank all of the people that have watched this session at XpoNorth and encourage you to sign up for others. It's a terrific event, and we're pleased that you come. And hopefully this time next year, we'll be able to do it all in person. So thank you, Lindsey, Pauline, and James. And for some of us, it's on to a lovely evening. And for James, I'm afraid it's on to the rest of the day for you, sir. So thank you very much indeed for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.